It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing. But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people.
In a series of events that have unfolded over the past few days, tensions between Israel and the United Nations have escalated. It all started when UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made remarks regarding the recent attack by Hamas on Israel. Guterres said the attack by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. He also said that the events of October 7th, the terror attacks, were because Israel had denied basic rights to the Palestinian people. Israel, naturally, was left fuming. It asked Guterres to resign. Responding to Guterres' comments, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Gilad Erdan, announced that Israel would deny visas to United Nations officials. Erdan also said that the move came after Guterres' remarks, which according to him seemed to justify Hamas's terrorist attacks on Israel.
Mr. Secretary General, the UN was established to prevent atrocities, to prevent such atrocities like the barbaric atrocities that Hamas committed. But the UN is failing. The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism. Hamas, as the minister explained, beheaded babies, burned families, raped women, abducted kids, babies, Holocaust survivors. And the SG is blaming the victim? You are blaming Israel? This is a pure blood libel. This is a pure blood libel, and I think that the Secretary General must resign. Because from now on, every day that he is here in this building, unless he apologizes immediately, today we called him to apologize, there's no justification to the existence of this building.
Guterres' comments were made during a special UN Security Council meeting where he emphasized that the attacks by Hamas should be understood within a broader context. Israel's response to these comments was very swift. Israel demanded Guterres' resignation. In fact, the foreign minister of Israel, Eli Cohen, cancelled a planned meeting with the UN Secretary General following his comments at the Security Council. Now, after this controversy, Guterres attempted to clarify his position by posting on social media platforms. Guterres expressed that the Palestinian people's grievances could not justify the violent attacks by Hamas, nor could Israel justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian population.
I am shocked by the misrepresentations by some of my statement yesterday in the Security Council, as if I was justifying acts of terror by Hamas. This is false. It was the opposite. In the beginning of my intervention yesterday, I clearly stated, and I quote, I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented 7 October acts of terror by Hamas in Israel.
But let us for a moment examine what Guterres said and whether there is any historical context or claim to what he said. Now, the historical claims of the Palestinian people to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are deeply rooted in the contentious history of this region. Prior to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, these territories were part of what was called Mandatory Palestine under British rule. The Palestinian Arab population had lived there for multiple generations. They had formed a distinct community there. They had a unique cultural heritage and, of course, historical ties to the land. The accusation of Israeli occupation stems from the events following the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, which led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Arab Palestinians. Now, many Palestinians believe that Israel's establishment there amounted to the displacement and the dispossession of their people, which they view as an occupation of their ancestral homeland. 20 years later, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel gained control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, solidifying the accusations of occupation. Now, these areas Israel had agreed, first through the Camp David Accords and then through the Oslo Peace Accords, to be earmarked for a future Palestinian state. Israel had publicly committed in the past to a peaceful two-state solution. Israel's establishment of settlements, particularly in the West Bank, is also in Gaza, and its control over essential resources going into Gaza have fueled further accusations of encroachment into Palestinian territories. Palestinians argue that these settlements are illegal under international law and that Israel's presence undermines their right to self-determination. But what about prior to 1948, prior to the establishment of the world's only Jewish state? What is the historical evidence of the Jewish people settling in and around what is modern-day Israel? The historical evidence of Jewish settlement in this region dates back thousands of years. The Jewish presence in this region goes back to biblical times, with claims being based on religious texts. Jerusalem, for example, is a city of immense religious significance to the Jews. It has a history of Jewish habitation dating back over 3,000 years. Historical accounts mention the Jewish kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Jerusalem was a central city before its conquest by various ancient empires like the Babylonians, the Romans, the Byzantines, and so on. The conquest then led to the dispersion of the Jewish population, but it did not sever their connection to that land. Despite widespread dispersion, Jewish communities persisted in that region throughout the ages, particularly in Jerusalem, in Safed, and in Hebron. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Zionist movement sought to re-establish a Jewish homeland in Israel. This movement gained momentum, particularly after Hitler's persecution of Jews, which led them to realize that they need a state which protects the rights of the Jewish people to life, land, and livelihood. Hence, when the British were leaving the erstwhile colonized lands in West Asia in 1947-48, they decided to hand over parts of mandatory Palestine to the Jews for the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. Now, which brings us to the question, can Israel or any other country remove a sitting United Nations Secretary General? The answer is no. Israel, or any individual country for that matter, cannot remove a sitting UN Secretary General, not even the permanent members of the UN Security Council. The process of appointing and removing the UN Secretary General is governed by the UN Charter and is not under the control of any one single member state. The United Nations Secretary General is appointed by the UN General Assembly upon a recommendation from the UN Security Council. Once he's in office or she is in office, the Secretary General serves a renewable 5-year term and can only be removed through a specific process. That process has been outlined. It requires a vote to happen, and a majority of members have to be present and have to vote in favor of the UN Secretary General. Removal typically occurs under very, very exceptional circumstances. There has to be grave evidence of serious misconduct to remove a sitting Secretary General. There has been no precedent whatsoever of a sitting UN Secretary General being removed from office in the history of the United Nations. So that brings us to the present day context of what is going on between Hamas and Israel, the war that's currently on, and whether or not what the UN Secretary General said has a historical basis. He also went on to say that Israel should follow the rules of war. Israel's contention to that is what happened on the 7th of October did not follow any civilized rules of any country in the world. Innocent women, children, and elderly people were attacked. That is not something that any civilized state would condone or any civilized law would actually consider as okay. So Israel's justification for what it is doing now and what it plans to do further, that is a ground invasion, is that you cannot have established or accepted civilized rules and laws when it comes to dealing with terror organizations like Hamas. So how this story plays out depends on two factors. One, of course, the efficacy of Israel's ground operations against Hamas and whether or not it can achieve its stated objective of rooting out Hamas completely. And yet at the same time, there is a second, perhaps just as important factor that's at play, that the sympathy and the moral high ground that Israel has had in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks, that is now directly proportional to what potential civilian casualties there could be in Gaza.